Welcome to Tetratypes In Depth, a new series for longer, source-led explorations of the history and theory of socionics. These are not foundations episodes. Here we can slow down, return to the original texts, and distinguish what an author actually argued from what later readers may have made of it. In this first episode, we turn to Victor Talanov and four Reinin Dichotomies: Constructivism and Emotivism, Tactics and Strategy, Yielding and Obstinacy, Carefreeness and Foresight. In English, they can sound like tidy personality labels. In Talanov's work, they were part of a more ambitious attempt to explain how related patterns might arise together. This is a historical close reading. We will look at Talanov's Russian language argument, the vocabulary he inherited, and the limits of the evidence. The question is not whether to turn an old paper into a final answer. It is to understand, as clearly as possible, what the paper was trying to do. The starting point is Grigory Reinin's formal work. Reinin showed that when the basic Jungian socionic dichotomies are combined in a particular way, further binary criteria can be derived. The familiar list contains 15 criteria. That framework is structural. It tells us which contrasts can be generated from a system of dichotomies. By itself, it does not settle the psychological meaning of every contrast, nor does it establish a biological mechanism behind one. Other socionics writers supplied names, descriptions, applications, and revisions. The history is therefore layered. Reinin supplied a formal framework. Augusta supplied the foundational information metabolism theory and much of the semantic setting in which the criteria were understood. Later, authors developed their own readings. Talanov enters this history neither as the inventor of all the names nor as a simple popularizer. He attempts an explanatory bridge for a selected group of 4 pairs. Talanov's key text appeared in 2006. Its title may be translated as Semantic Content and Physiological Interpretation of the Socionic Criteria, Constructivism, Emotivism, Tactics, Strategy, Yielding, Obstinacy, and Carefreeness, Foresight. The title announces 2 tasks. First, clarify what the terms mean. Second, propose an interpretation in physiological language. The paper belongs to the early public phase of Model T. In 2005, Talanov had already discussed Reinin criteria more broadly. In 2006, the treatment of these 4 pairs became more focused and appeared alongside Model T material in Kiev conference contexts. His central move is easy to miss. He does not treat each dichotomy as an isolated trait. He treats the 4 pairs as patterns produced by relations between information domains. For 2 pairs, the contrast is balance and imbalance. For the other 2, it is the relative strength of signals. Those are Talanov's technical terms, and they need careful handling. The first pair is Constructivism and Emotivism. The Russian term for constructivism comes from a word meaning constructive, or concerned with building and ordering. The Russian term for emotivism is formed from the word emotion, but it does not simply mean emotionality. In Talanov's account, constructivists have logic that is balanced and ethics that is unbalanced. Emotivists have the reverse arrangement. This is not the everyday opposition between cold reasoning and warm feeling. It is a proposed pattern in the coordination of logical and ethical information. That is why the English name can mislead. A constructivist is not necessarily practical or emotionally restrained. An emotivist is not simply expressive. Talanov uses an inherited Socionics label, but gives it a technical re-description. The distinctive part of his account is the proposed mechanism of balance across logic and ethics. The second pair is tactics and strategy. The English words are close to the Russian terms, but they can still cause a misunderstanding. Talanov is not simply contrasting short-term planners with long-term planners, or improvisers with people who make plans. His formulation links the pair to sensing and intuition. Tactical types are described as having balanced sensing and unbalanced intuition. Strategic types are described as having balanced intuition and unbalanced sensing. The language is systematic. One information domain is relatively integrated, while the complementary domain is relatively uneven. The risk is to import everyday military or management meanings. For Talanov, these terms name positions in a four-part account of information processing, not a behavioral checklist. Strategy does not mean superior foresight, and tactics does not mean a lack of long-range thought. The descriptive label and the proposed Model T explanation are not the same thing. The third pair is yielding and obstinacy. This is one of the more difficult names to carry into English without distortion. The Russian word usually translated as yieldingness can mean readiness to make a concession or accommodate. The word translated as obstinacy can mean stubbornness, persistence, or being hard to move. Talanov associates yielding with relatively weak ethical signals and strong logical signals. Obstinacy has the reverse relation, but strong and weak must not be read as strong people and weak people. They are not measures of intelligence, competence, feeling, or worth. They are technical terms in Talanov's proposed signal model. The pair, therefore, does not license a character judgment. Talanov is trying to connect a familiar Reinin criterion to the relative prominence of ethical and logical signals. He changes the question from, "Is this person agreeable?" to, "What kind of information is treated as relatively forceful within this model?" The fourth pair is carefreeness and foresight. The traditional English wording is useful, but the Russian has more texture. Carefreeness can suggest freedom from worry, but also a degree of heedlessness. The Russian word, translated as foresight, means not only seeing ahead, but also prudence and practical provision for what has been anticipated. Talanov aligns carefreeness with relatively weak sensing signals and strong intuitive signals. Foresight has the reverse relation. Again, this is not a judgment about whether someone notices the physical world or can predict the future. It is a technical contrast within the model. The names remain humanly recognizable. Carefreeness looks less toward guarding against immediate contingencies. Foresight builds provision into the picture. Talanov's contribution is to connect that contrast to sensing and intuition, while keeping the descriptive names separate from the theoretical explanation. Why place these four pairs together? In Talanov's architecture, they are not four disconnected descriptions. Constructivism and Emotivism, and tactics and strategy concern balance and imbalance across the logic and ethics and sensing and intuition axes. Yielding and obstinacy, and carefreeness and foresight concern the relative strength of signals across those same oppositions. This is the point of treating them as a tetratypic system. Four related binary differentiations arranged together. The pattern gives Talanov a way to link semantic contrasts to an underlying functional picture, but a tidy diagram can make a hypothesis seem inevitable. It was not. Talanov offered an explanatory construction within Model T with physiological language and empirical ambitions. The source does not make that construction settled science. A fair account preserves both facts. The proposal has internal coherence, and its larger claims remain provisional. Translation is not a cosmetic issue here. The Russian names carry ordinary associations, technical use, and a history of previous translations at the same time. Constructivism can suggest construction, ordering, or constructive formation. Emotivism is a learned term formed from emotion, rather than an everyday word for being emotional. Yieldingness is the quality of conceding or accommodating, while obstinacy is stubborn persistence. Carefreeness can be pleasantly free from worry, or imprudently unconcerned. Foresight carries the additional sense of prudent preparation. The English names are useful handles. They are not transparent definitions. The safest approach is to show the Russian term on screen, give a brief gloss, and then return to Talanov's own explanation. We should not translate these words into a fresh, competing theory. In this episode, they remain labels for the four pairs, as Talanov understood them. Model T is the context in which Talanov's account becomes most ambitious. The four dichotomies are presented as compatible with a larger model of information processing and physiological organization. This helps explain the unusual vocabulary of balanced, unbalanced, strong, and weak signals. The vocabulary is explanatory, not merely descriptive. Talanov wants to say why the dichotomy patterns arise, not only how people appear in conversation. That aspiration distinguishes his intervention from a simple list of type traits. It also creates a strict reading rule. We should say that Talanov proposes, Talanov interprets, and within Model T. We should not silently upgrade his physiological interpretation into an established neuroscientific result. The historical significance lies in the attempt to give selected Reinin criteria a mechanism. Whether one accepts that mechanism is a separate question from understanding what the text says. Talanov also referred to a wider field of Reinin criteria: positivist and negativist, process and result, merry and serious, judicious and decisive, aristocratic and democratic, and others. His earlier 2005 discussions reach beyond the four pairs developed in the 2006 paper. However, completeness is not the same as symmetry. The available 2006 text directly develops the four pairs we have followed. It does not give an equally explicit Model T derivation for every other named Reinin dichotomy. On democracy and aristocracy, for example, later Model T summaries present an explanation with explicitly hypothetical status. That boundary matters. It is tempting to make every Reinin name slot perfectly into a later diagram. A source-led account must distinguish a title, a passing list, a descriptive discussion, and a worked theoretical derivation. In this case, the deep treatment belongs to four connected pairs. The wider catalogue remains important but unevenly documented. The cleanest historical comparison has three layers. Reinin supplied a formal account of derived criteria. Augusta's foundational work supplied the information metabolism framework and much of the semantic environment in which criteria were named and understood. Talanov later tried to supply a particular explanatory mechanism for a selected tetrad of pairs. Other major Socionists, including Bukalov, Gulenko, and Filatova, developed their own descriptions, applications, and terminologies around the Reinin dichotomies. Agreement on a name does not mean agreement on its mechanism. Their work should not be silently projected back into Talanov's 2006 argument. The key point is neither to erase continuity nor manufacture unanimity. Talanov inherits the formal and lexical tradition, but changes the explanatory question. Rather than asking only which dichotomies distinguish types, he asks how four of them might arise from a coordinated underlying pattern. Talanov's four tetrachotomies show an important moment in the history of socionics, a move from formal derivation and familiar descriptive labels toward a proposed explanatory mechanism. Constructivism and Emotivism, tactics and strategy, yielding and obstinacy, Carefreeness and Foresight. Their English names are useful, but their Russian wording matters. Their place in the Reinin tradition matters, and the limits of the source matter. Talanov did not create the entire vocabulary from nothing. He attempted to make four established criteria function together inside Model T. That makes the paper valuable whether or not one accepts its physiological theory. It lets us see an author trying to connect language, typology, and mechanism while leaving us the responsibility to distinguish a coherent proposal from a demonstrated fact. For the Russian passages, translations, and references behind this episode, consult the accompanying Tetratypes research edition. The best way to understand Talanov is not to flatten him into a later system, but to let the original argument speak in its own historical voice.